I want to give this video the title of Covering for a False Prophet, as the Seventh-day Adventists do. Could you imagine God giving Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Isaiah, Daniel, or one of his other prophets a word of prophecy or a word to give to his people, and then years later going back and said, oh, no, Jeremiah or Isaiah or Ezekiel or Daniel, I told you wrong back then. I need to correct that and tell you different now. I told you wrong back then. Could you imagine God doing that? But such is the case of the Seventh-day Adventists and their false prophetess Ellen White, and how they try to cover for things, mistakes she made in her writings. Now remember, her writings are supposed to be inspired by her own admission. She got these words from God and these visions from God, and they should not be changed. But yet in the early writings, she attributes the death of James to Antipas, Herod Antipas, the same Herod who was responsible for the death of Christ. And we know that Herod Antipas was not responsible for the death of James. It was Herod Agrippa. Now, in her book, she writes this after she's talking about how Pilate had realized he had made a mistake and how troubled he was over the death of Christ and how he had put him to death. And one of the parts of talking about Pilate says this, and I quote, "Despaired and anguished, crushed every hope for joyful feeling. He refused to be comforted and died a most miserable death," end quote, talking about Pilate. Then he goes on to say about Herod now, Herod's heart has still grown harder. And when he had heard that Christ was risen, he was that much more troubled. He took the life of James. And when he saw that he was pleased the Jews, he took Peter also, intended to put him to death. But God had a work for Peter to do and sent his angels to deliver him, end quote. In other words, she's attributing the death of James to Antipas, when we know that it was not Herod Antipas who was responsible for the death of James. It was Herod Agrippa, which was years later in circa 41 or 42. But yet Ellen White, in her truthful word from God, and her visions from God, and her inspired words from God, God must have lied to her and told her that Antipas, Herod Antipas, who killed James, and not Herod Agrippa. Well, somewhere down the line, the Seventh-day Adventists found out she's made a mistake. She's done got a wrong word from God, or showed God to be a liar. She's lying one. And so they go back and they insert in between Herod's heart growing still hard, they insert this paragraph in there. It was Herod Antipas who took the part in the trial of Jesus, and Herod Agrippa, one who put James to death. So they go back and try to correct the errors of their false prophet. It's just kind of like God giving her the inspired vision in which she was wrong. And now God is running back later in years to correct what he told her wrong to start with. Like God's out there just lying to people and laughing himself away in heaven, and then going back years later and changing it. Ellen White attributed the death of James the Apostle to Herod Antipas, when all of history shows that it was Herod Agrippa I who did it. She did not know what she was talking about, and she attributed the death of James to Herod Antipas and not Herod Agrippa. Years later, Seventh-day Adventist, the Ellen White Estates, or whoever it was, goes back and tries to correct this and puts in there, it was Herod Antipas who took the trial of Jesus, and Herod Agrippa I who put James to death. So they go back and correct their prophet. Wonder how many more mistakes Ellen White made that they had to go back and correct. Oh well. Until next time, this has been Golly saying, God bless.